Уважаемые дамы и господа,
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We begin our panel discussion, which is dedicated to the issues of economic growth, sustainability in Russia. First and foremost, allow me to introduce you to the panelists who participate in our today's discussion. First, Elvira Nabiulia, Central Bank Governor, Maxim Oreshkin, Minister for Economic Development, Anton Siluanov, Finance Minister of Russia. Can you hear me well? Our next speaker is Kristalina Georgieva, Chief Executive Officer of the World Bank, Viktor Vekselberg, Chairman of Renova Group, and Pavel Kaduchnikov, President of the Strategic Development Center. Unfortunately, Alexei Kudrin, who has been on the list of the speakers, is still in hospital, and he couldn't join us. I wish him a speedy recovery, and let us begin our today's session. From the outset, just to give a framework to our today's discussion, let me dwell a little bit on the issues at hand to be discussed today. Economic growth in Russia. This year, we've seen positive economic growth rate. In 2015, we saw our GDP drop by 1.5% after the devaluation of 2014. Our gross national income losses were larger. The drop was at 13 to 14%. In 2016, we saw a very low reduction, 0.2% in terms of our GDP. And according to our estimates, in 2017, the growth rate stood at around 1.5%. So why have we seen this economic growth? Is it sustainable? This is what we intend to discuss today. Of particular importance is what were the factors accounting for the economic growth? Is it a structural growth, that is the part of the GDP accounted for by the capital factors such as labor and capital and other factors, or is it just a short-term economic growth, the business cycle factors? Maybe there were other factors involved, some other things that spurred on the economic growth. Maybe it is also worthwhile talking about it if it's just a short-term phenomenon, how the interest rate of the central bank has affected it, because the central bank had been reducing it for quite some time. And if we calculate the real interest rate by subtracting inflation from the interest rate, then you'll see that the interest rate was around 0 last year. How this affected our economic growth is also very important. How the depreciation and subsequent appreciation of the ruble have affected our economic growth. It is a very subtle issue. At the Gaidar Academy, we're trying to use different models to calculate these things. The outcomes are being discussed at this particular forum, at other sections, and this audience, we're not going to talk about the models themselves, but you've got the outcomes of the calculations, I believe. Different models are used by the Finance Ministry and the Economic Development Ministry. Maybe our colleagues are going to share with us their view on these matters. As for the drivers behind the economic growth, investment has grown over the course of the 3 quarters, 3.5 to 4%. Why is that? How to account for this growth in investment? Are the enterprises trying to use the accelerator model, adjusting their capital, increasing it? Is it because the business climate has improved? Is it because the inflation has gone down? Or are there other factors, such as better external economic environment. It is yet another matter to be discussed, and there is no definitive answer. How the world economy has affected us, what is its contribution? Last year, the economic growth rate globally was more than 2.3%, I believe. Well, at least that's the estimate that I got. Or maybe there is a reverse effect, like the one in 2009 when the world economy dropped a little bit, but the GDP in Russia dropped further. The Ukrainian economy decreased even more. The investment is decreasing very much because the investment expenditure is decreasing when the environment is bad. Maybe this is what resulted and the drop in our GDP that we saw in 2009. Maybe right now we see another recovery here. Maybe the world economic recovery has helped us, but there are issues related with imports and exports that might have played in and have to be factored in. And once again, I do not have any definitive answers, but we can talk about all of this. We can also talk about the dynamics of the currency exchange rate. In 2015, for the first time, we saw a drop of the salaries and wages share in the GDP by 1 percentage point. It increased the share of profits, and our companies became more competitive. But in 2016, we saw these processes slow down, and in 2017, we reached the pre-depreciation levels. The flexible growth sets into balance, into equilibrium, not just the balance of payments, but also the economy. And it can result into the redistribution of income to favor the enterprises. In 2017, we saw a very low inflation rate, which is good in and of itself because it decreases the unpredictability in the economy, and it can be yet another factor driving economic growth. You can insure yourself against many things, such as the currency exchange rate dynamics, the prices, but you cannot insure yourself against inflation. High inflation decreases investment. Maybe it was yet another factor to be taken into account. This is roughly the framework of our discussion we're going to build today, and we have decided to split our discussion into 3 big blocks. First, what happened in 2017 and how to account for it. Next, what we have to do in order to nurture this growth. And yet another array of issues that I've prepared specifically to ask our colleagues, and they're going to be specific, not related to the general discussion. They're going to be different for each and every panelist, and they are still going to be related with economic growth. We're going to hold 3 sessions to know the opinion of the audience. We're going to reserve that for the end. We're going to save some time, and I'll ask colleagues to share some thoughts, and we'll talk about the outcome of these polls to be held at this august audience. We have distributed the remote controls to be able to vote. I would also like to introduce to you the Russian Journal of Economics. You can see the copies at the entrance. Alexei Kudrin wanted to tell it to himself, but since he's absent, he's editor-in-chief of the journal, and I would like to recommend this journal to you by all means. Have a look at it. Now, let's get down to our questions. The first question goes to the audience, not to the speakers. The first issue we'd like to ask you to vote on. To vote, you can ask any remote to get it from the standby regime. Then you'll see the question and different variants. Once you listen to the sound and before the gong sounds, you can vote. The first question. Do you agree that the global economy has recovered from the 2008 crisis and the Russian economy, from the crisis of 2015 to 2016? And there are 4 variants of answer. Both yes, global economy yes, Russian economy no, global economy no, Russian economy yes, and both no. You have to choose one answer. Please proceed to vote now. Meanwhile, are you taking my mic? Do you think I also have to vote? The audience is so large. I believe my opinion is hardly going to affect anything. Yes, that's true. My first question goes to the Minister for Economic Development of the Russian Federation, Maxim Oreshkin. What do you think are the key factors? Are we going to wait for the results? I would hate to affect the outcome of the vote. No, we're not going to show you the results. We're only going to show the results at the very end. Colleagues, have you voted? Or is there anyone? Can we proceed now? I'm sorry, I'm choosing the wrong mic. It seems I've taken yours. Has the vote been concluded? Good. Maxim Oreshkin, the floor goes to you. Could you dwell a little bit on the 2017 economic growth factors? I believe you've dwelled on all of these issues at the very beginning. I have not cited any figures, and I haven't expressed my opinions. Indeed, let me dwell on the statistics then. In 2017 is the beginning of steady growth. So far, we do not know what the GDP growth rate is. It is quite hard to calculate. All the statistical agencies need additional time as well as additional sources to get the figures ready. But I've jotted down some concrete factors and figures we can divulge. Our air transport plus 20%, energy consumption 1.8%, the road freight 2.8%, cars 12%. If you have a look at all those increases, you can see that those indicators are very good. It looks like what we saw in 2018 when the economic growth recovered, the economy recovered after the 2008 crisis. And if you want to describe 2017 in one word, then you can call it the year when the adaptation to the changed external environment has been completed. And I'm going to talk about new elements of our policy, inflation targeting, the floating rate, the budget rule, as well as protecting our internal market from the oil price fluctuations. These 4 macroeconomic factors have changed drastically the environment in which the Russian economy exists. You can look at different segments. The most prominent example is certainly the situation in the forex market. In 2017, we saw the historic minimum lows in volatility. We have delinked the ruble exchange rate from the oil prices. Since April, the oil prices have increased by 25%, whereas the normal prices have decreased by 8%. Whereas last year we saw a different situation. The oil prices were stable and the ruble was depreciating. I remember several years ago, the inflation rates were at 15%, and we gathered at this hall. And when the inflation rate was 15%, not a single person who was in the hall back then believed that the main discussion in 2017 would be whether it is good or bad that our inflation rate deviates from the inflation target by 1.5%. So the issues we are concerned with today seemed ridiculous several years ago, I believe. But what we see is just the tip of the iceberg. The successful structural reforms in macroeconomics have laid a very solid foundation for long-term sustainable growth. We'll see what it's going to be this year and next year. That is our prospects for 2017. Thank you very much. Madam Nabiulina, if you don't mind, the questions that I have posed, could you dwell on them? What Mr. Ereshkin has said is very important. Has there been a delinquent or not? And secondly, we have transitioned to the floating rate, but very gradually. Remember 2014, when we held the rate for some time and it allowed the economy to adapt. The central bank is responsible for the exchange rate. It is not managing it, but still it's monitoring it. Could you dwell on that a little bit? In 2017, we have indeed reached the growth rates as anticipated by the central bank. You can argue whether it is a little bigger or a little smaller, but we anticipated that by 2017 we would see the completion of recovery of what was lost in the crisis, and we anticipate growth rates of 2% or 1.5%. And right now we are at a turning point. We believe that we have made up for the losses, and there is a question now how we're going to grow further. Macroeconomic stability has allowed the economy to not to go down too much, because there are some inbuilt stabilizers such as the budget rule and before that the floating exchange rate. But right now the challenge is how to achieve economic growth rates. So a little bit about the world economy, and afterwards I'll dwell a little bit on the currency exchange rate. We started to grow together with the world economy, certainly. The world economic growth is a boon to Russia's economy. For a certain extent, our growth is accounted for by the world economic growth. We are an open economy. We have a large share of external trade. Our economy is dependent on export, yes, money export, but exports set the dynamics of the GDP growth. What's going to happen in the coming months and years in the world economy is important. So many ask themselves whether there are risks posed by the world economy to us in 2018 and afterwards. We're going to see the normalization of monetary policy in the industrialized economies. We have already seen the beginning of this normalization. This is going to increase in higher transactional costs and different flows of capitals. We hope that this normalization is going to go along smoothly. We see how some world banks are tightening their monetary policy, but we are going to look closely at the monetary risks. Right now there is a euphoria because the oil prices are high, but we understand, all of us, that there is a volatility and unpredictability in the oil market. There are other types of risks in the world economy related to the dynamics of output and economic growth rate in China. Many investors thinking about that. 2 years ago, there were risks of landing of China's economy, but we believe these risks are moderate. There are also risks related to a possible surge in protectionism, as well as a reduction of the role played by global trade. But this is going to be a prolonged process. It's going to take time. As for the risks of the world economy related to the oil prices, we have to look at the balance of payments, at the ruble exchange rate, at the budget revenues, as well as at the GDP. According to our estimates, our economy remains dependent on the oil prices, and this dependence is significant. But our economy has become less vulnerable to huge possible fluctuations of the oil prices, and one can go as far as to say that the balance of payments and the budget are less dependent on such fluctuations. The economy in general is still dependent, and we can see that from the statistics, from the figure, we can see how the share has decreased of oil and gas revenues in the budget from more than 50% to 40%. The share of export revenue has decreased, but the energy share in the economy is still quite significant. So the budget, the balance of payments have adapted, and they can live even amid low oil prices, and they can withstand oil prices fluctuations thanks to the exchange rate as well as the budget rule. But the economy needs to diversify itself. This task has not yet been completed. This is a challenge for the coming years. And in this particular context, a particular role has been played not just by the floating exchange rate. I would also like to point out the budget rule, which is a huge stabilizer for the real exchange rate. We have to look not at the nominal exchange rate, but at the real exchange rate. Let me remind you that post-2008, we saw a stable nominal exchange rate, 30 rubles per $1. But the real exchange rate had appreciated, had strengthened, and it affected the competitiveness of our enterprises. So the advantage of the budget rule consists in the fact that it helps us stabilize the real exchange rate. And in this sense, it provides a platform to propel forward the competitiveness of the Russian economy. Thank you. I would like to ask the next question. I'd like to pose it to Anton Siluanov as a follow-up to the previous questions. Could you elaborate a little bit? You know, Madam Nabiulina, as if she had read my thoughts, I wanted to ask her the following. In the second half of the year, the finance ministry acquired quite a lot of forex using the budget rule. Certainly, it prevented the appreciation of the ruble. But as far as we know, a number of industries and their competitiveness are dependent not just on the possibility of selling something at a lower price abroad, or rather bigger price abroad, but some are also dependent on imports. What about this budget rule? Has it helped the process or not? I'd like to know what you think. And how big of a factor was it? Do we have to change anything or something? Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm very glad that all who have been participating in the discussion think positively about the budget rule. There are many proponents, but there are also opponents who want to either loosen it or change it so as to use the expenditure in order to spur on the economic growth. But there is a more fundamental issue. The thing is, this budget rule is not just meant to create a cushion for the budget and to have some reserves in place. But the budget rule is about predictability, about being able to forecast. We have to minimize the risks of the crisis returning, the crisis which we saw in the recent years. These crises were due to decreases of oil prices, the expenditure had to be cut, the interest rate, the currency exchange rate, they all were destabilized. This is how each and every crisis proceeded and unfolded. When the budget rule was introduced, we said we are building our budget as well as our liabilities under a certain price, namely $40 per barrel. And all the additional revenue from oil and gas, we're not simply spending this money, we're not wasting them, we are putting them aside, sort of saving them. And it helps to increase the predictability. Investors understand full well, however much the oil prices fluctuate, however much they change, the exchange rate is going to move a lot more smoothly. And this is very important for our exporters and importers to be able to predict what is going to happen. It is important for our citizens, for small and medium enterprises. And this is exactly what helps us to achieve the stability of fundamental macroeconomic factors, which we have to fix in order to be able to grow further. I agree with the central governor. We need some structural changes and reforms. We spoke about that at previous panels. We have to pay more attention to the human capital, to the infrastructure, to competition. All of this is important. But the basic condition, stability, is accounted for by the budget rule in particular. And I have to tell you that this year, the budget rule is going to allow us not just to smoothen the way, because the oil prices have increased. Yes, our exchange rate has strengthened a little bit, but we have got down to conduct some forex operations in the markets, to acquire some forex, and we're going to prevent the exchange rate from strengthening sharply. If we ask our businessmen, they're going to tell us that in certain industries, the strengthening of the exchange rate is a bane because imported goods will flood the market. We are going to use the budget rule, but not to sustain the competitiveness, but to make our line and our exchange rate predictable. And each and every business is going to make a decision for themselves. And how this is going to be affected by the inflows and outflows of capital and oil prices fluctuations. The budget rule will also help us ensure some revenue, forex, around 3% of the GDP we're going to get. This money can get put into our reserves if the oil prices grow. Thank you, Mr. Siluanov. And what about the budget deficit? It was supposed to be more than 1.5% of the GDP. According to the tentative estimates, we're going to have a surplus. Is it a success or not? Are you talking about 2018? In 2017, we saw a deficit of 1.5%. According to the blueprint, we accounted for 2.5% deficit. Then we revisited the forecast to 2%, right now 1.5%. And this year we're having to be a deficit of 3.2%. But if the environment is the same as it is now, we're going to have a surplus. Thank you, Pavel Anatolievich. I would also like to ask you a question. What do you think about all of this? Maybe you could also share your opinion as well as the opinion of the Center of Strategic Development.
Thank you. Our center has been watching closely the economic developments, and our main point is to achieve structural growth and proper rates, how to up it. 2017 outcomes for us are as expected or probably marginally above average expectations. Out of the things mentioned, what are the positive things? The investments. 3.2% investments growth in 3 quarters, but the third quarter saw deceleration, and we are to wait for the fourth quarter. But anyway, it is what we have on the positive side. The reduction in the exchange rate, recovery of global economy, and the growth of export in double digit, which is a positive factor. Another driver is the decelerating inflation, macroeconomic stability, which is a very good institutional thing, and we are to preserve it for decades to come. And probably, most likely, and arguably, we'll see a recovery in a business cycle, and probably in 2 or 3 years, we will see more positive dynamics. What do we have on the negative side? most importantly, it's a long-lasting trend, which is our demography. The working age population has been shrinking, and the unemployment close to record lows is something that wouldn't allow us to enhance economic growth from a labor perspective. Wages grow as well as the costs ahead of the productivity, low consumer demand. The economy is probably out of the woods. We'll wait for the voting results, but our people, the population, is yet quite wary, and they don't step up their expenditure. They prefer to save, and we can see low structural growth rates, and there is uncertainty about what the government is going to do in terms of structural reforms. We are aware of the technology development and progress and human capital development and greater efficiency of public administration. These are very important drivers to edge the structural growth up. But in 2017, still we have the adjustment growth, the rebounding growth. Thank you. Victor, being one from the business community, we mentioned the growth of investment of 4.2% in the first 3 quarters. From your perspective, do you think it's a sustainable trend and it will last? And do you think that the entrepreneurs have more credibility and they step up investments, or is it not? I don't confine you anyway, so you may speak up whatever you want. Thank you so much. I'm an optimist by nature, and I would really like to respond in a positive way with respect that we are at a stage of sustainable growth currently. But frankly, if we do some analysis, we heard the figures and the numbers, we've got growth, but it's quite patchy, quite uneven by sectors. And here we see the impact of different factors, like the outcomes of the 2017 may be built on the measures to stabilize the financial sector, but at the same time, one should mention that there are lots of issues and problems unresolved and structural reforms to be conducted, yet to be conducted, and that will help us believe that industrial investment growth is stable, should be stable. And for our holding, the Renova holding, 2017 was relatively successful, and the numbers are self-indicative. Versus 2016, our investments volume increased by around 50% in absolute numbers. We are up from 36 billion to 50 billion of investments. And the growth plan of ours for 2018 may see it double. We plan in 2018 the investments to the tune of 100 billion rubles for the holding. Where do we put up our money? This is the energy sector, the conventional, unconventional subsectors, infrastructure, like our airports branch, another opening up prospect in agriculture. We have large-scale developments in agro-business. And last but not least is the high-tech, indeed, the high-tech sector. All those things related to the digital economy. We believe in that. We have faith in that. It has the potential because of the high growth in labor productivity, which one cannot do without, which is the bulk of the upside. And this year we established a branch called Zifra, to tackle the industrial Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and big data analysis and all those things that underlie all the aspects of the digital economy. Another positive driver I would like to emphasize, and once again the statistics are indicative and self-evident, is our innovation center Skolkovo and its outcomes. Last year we had a startup village event, an open innovation forum that pointed to much greater interest in this sector, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And it is of importance to recall that the innovation today sees the unflagging interest from our youths. We had a call for Skoltech among students, and one student position for Russians was 30 people competing for one seat. And for international students, the quota is lower. The quota of places is lower, of seats is lower, and we had 100 applications per seat. So the competition was much tighter. Mostly these are from CIS, but it doesn't matter. So it is a proof positive of the fact that the economic actors believe in innovation. And responding to what you asked, I must say, and the government has been working hard, by the by, I must say that if the digital economy program will be implemented as announced, I think we'll have a very considerable groundwork for further growth in all the sectors. But I cannot but mention some negative aspects. Being on the business community side, we still have some pending issues to tackle and resolve. An issue which is quite important to carry forward an investment program is the access to finance, most importantly in the long run. We haven't been able to overcome the low availability of loan supply and credit supply. And the efforts taken by the central bank, the action taken to bring the banking environment in order, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, all those things are quite correct and important and necessary, but on the other hand, banks are quite prudent and cautious in originating loans. The requirements are very stringent and tight, and they don't want to assume any risks, but doing business means risking. And it is yet an outstanding issue. And the second element to prop up the investment climate and bolster the entrepreneurial spirit is the excessive activity by the oversight and regulation bodies. The number of inspections that we've been facing today is extremely high. The data vary. By the Economic Development Ministry, it's about 2 million unforeseen, outstanding inspections per year, but the business community says it's 4 times this figure, or 5 times. And there is kind of lack of confidence in business, and lack of confidence is an economic category, which is fraught, today the oversight machinery is fraught with. It's quite disheartening for the business community. If we speak about the growth stability, these are the things that are we to get to grips with in order to provide for greater stability. Victor, Thank you. A question to Kristalina Georgieva. An external perspective on the Russian economy and the results of the 2017. Would you speak up, please? Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I will start by saying that the economic minister has said that this past year was quite okay. So I reside mostly in the United States, and they love lotteries, and they love understatements. And I would say it was a brilliant year, a wonderful year, because in the past decade, the global economy was suffering, and that was felt in Russia in the recent years. And one of these years, we expected an upward movement, and we adjusted our forecasts upwards and downwards. Like the World Bank first started, the growth would be 1.3%, and now we see at the figures and say it's going to be 1.7 for 2017. So it's up. It's positive. I can see Mr. Shuvalov attending, and in terms of doing business rating, Russia has gone considerably up, and you now rank 35th, and you used to be in position number 40 before. It is a wonderful result, because 6 years ago Russia was number 120, but there are 3 indicators under which it's in top 10, and 1 indicator puts you on top 10 and other 3 on top 20. And the inflation has gone down and forgot to stop, and it's falling, and should cling at a certain point of time. And we've been quarreling where inflation should be stopped, we argue between ourselves. But why is it important? The confidence, public confidence, is of significance. The consumer demand should rise, as well as the economic growth. I want to indicate 3 achievements of 2017 that will have long-term impact. The fiscal rule, or budget rule, congratulations on that. I hope that, well, those who believe that the minister has achieved good results, will you raise your hands? You'll see those who are your allies, Mr. Minister. I'm one of those. I believe that your fiscal status now is much better, and is going to be do good for the sake of diversification. The second important decision was to adopt the digital economy program and plan of action to support the high-tech. And the result was impressive, because when the global trade went down, the exports of infotech from this country has doubled, and it's now at the rate of $7 billion per annum. And for a future Russia, it is so significant to deliver on that program. According to our reckoning, by 2025, it's going to be between 7 to 13 million of jobs. In that sector with the highest labor productivity. And the third decision is the systemic approach to predictability, to satisfy expectations. Why is that important? The only negative thing I can fancy is that when things are fine, the appetite for reforms declines. Christine Lagarde said, "We've got the sun. Let's repair our roof now." But we know when there is sun in the sky, we forget about the roof, all about the roof. We want to mend the roof and patch it up when it's going to rain. But the government and the central bank are quite right in focusing on the pending issues. The labor productivity is not too high, investment climate should be improved, and the human capital needs more investment in manpower. This is probably your plan for next year. Please, let's mend the roof. Thank you. I have still a specification, clarification. Why you said that the inflation should be stopped from falling? Do you think that with these inflation expectations that are quite high, around 7, 8 or 10% among our people, like to fall into the trap of liquidity and devaluation would be probably very difficult? Will you clarify? I don't want to say that inflation should be left to its own devices. No. I'm saying that it has dropped quite quickly. And the 4% rate is not bad, it's quite good. It's very important to keep inflation at bay and the expectations would be on par with the reality. Thank you. With this, we end the first round, and before we move to the second round, a question to the audience. The question is as follows. What do you think became the main driver of the economic growth in Russia in 2017? The one I asked for. Responses. Recovery growth after GDP reduction in 2015 and 16. Second option, improvement of external situation. Third, reduction of macroeconomic risks, low inflation, low budget deficit, predictable economic policies, rising optimism of economic actors, and the fourth is just coincidence of circumstances. Please vote. Once again, you will not see the results. Will you hide them? On the 18th of March, we'll have the results. Now another set of questions on how to prop up that growth. Mr. Oreshkin, what do you expect? What are your targets for 2018, and what shall your ministry do to this effect? And another question, because in the first round we forgot about sanctions. Isn't that of no significance for us? In the first round of what? Voting? No, the questions, I mean. I may possibly start by citing those possible drivers in 2018. The first one would be the consumer demand. If we look at the quarterly Russian Statistics Service data for the first quarter, we have the consumer demand growth by 5%. What we shall see next? We have a speeding salary growth in the private sector, soaring late last year, and the budget sector is joining suit, following suit, and we'll see more developments in the banking sector of the rescheduling of the NPL. If we look at the mortgages, year on year we see 70% growth, and the portfolios grow by 14% only. So So the 70% includes that huge share of refinancing, rescheduling of impaired mortgages. So the interest rates are at record lows. 9.8 is the rate of mortgage average rate in November. We never saw it before. The second growth driver is a lending cycle, moving to low rates and moving to sustainable expectations and predictable economic policy, macroeconomic policy, provide conditions for loan origination that will prop up the growth. In retail, it's mortgage, and corporate sector is going to be related to investments and capex, and the governmental programs are aimed at bolstering the credit cycle, which is the project finance factory of ours. Another program is beneficial and preferential 6.5% rate for small and medium enterprises, which is the definitive and final rate for them. All that will help us boost loan origination. We should not make the same mistake as in 2011, 2012, because we had the unbacked loans in the consumer sector, in the retail sector, with huge growth figures, and that was fraught with very many risks and entailed huge losses by banks. Emanating from that, the previous credit cycle had a third scenario is the investments activity. Mr. Vekselberg first was doubtful about that and said later then we had 50% growth of investments, and in 2018 we're going to double our investment plan. So in this domain, the investments will also be on the positive side, and the business community will perceive greater consumer demand growth, and another driver would be the positive impact of the new economic agenda that will be in shape by May. One of the important things would be, like what we've been talking about, is the new infrastructure investment program. Many things coming, but I will not mention them. It will be premature, especially for me. If we speak about 2018 and look at the banking forecasts, like Goldman Sachs was very accurate in projecting the deceleration of inflation in 2017. They say we'll have growth of 3.3% per annum. I don't think it's a realistic figure, but I think we will overperform the targets, and we'll see greater growth in 2017 than we had in 2018 than we had in 2017. Thank you. Let us continue to argue about the preconditions. I would support the terminology you harnessed, like the institutions. Low inflation is a cornerstone of macroeconomic stability. We're accustomed to high inflation rates, so now we marvel at the low figures. Madam Nabiulina, will you pronounce upon that? The 2.5% is below 4%, and many people said we should change our target for inflation to 2%, as in the industrialized countries. We don't accept that. We believe that the Russian economy is going to diversify and will undergo, as I hope, structural change. For this economy, for such an economy, 4% of inflation is a proper level of price hike. And we should not change our objectives, change horses in midstream, because the predictability is the main advantage of low inflation. People will start having confidence in low inflation. So our goal is to maintain it around 4% and minimize from the 4% figure both upwards and downwards. Unfortunately, we have ups and downs. We are to admit that. And in the mid-run, inflation will have more chances that inflation will go up than it's gonna go down. And This volatility may be high, and two pillars mentioned. The first one is the inflation expectations, which are the talk of the town. They are not very high, I wouldn't say, but they are not anchored. If we have some change of the exchange rate and the oil price, the inflation expectations may rise, like in Latin America countries that moved to the inflation targeting prior to us. And the main achievement of that process is that the expectations did not go up and down. And for us, it's a goal to achieve, to reduce that volatility. The second pillar is to reduce the non-monetary fluctuations. We'll speak about logistics and infrastructure and transport and storage of fruit and vegetables and perishable goods. This all impacts inflation. The more stable our inflation is, the faster the pace of relaxing our monetary policy. So far, it's moderately stringent, and the neutrality level for the monetary percent is around 6 to 7%. In the current context, our rate is so far above that level, but low inflation is not a coincidence of happy circumstances. No. It means the results of our consistent policies. The low inflation, what price have we paid? We have lower consumption, we have lower demand, some people say. But our calculations and reckoning show that if we had higher figures of inflation, the incomes of our people would dwindle faster and the consumption would fall down faster. Low inflation gives us an opportunity to up consumption rates, and we can see the growth in consumption in real life thanks to low inflation, which is a boon for our people because their salaries and savings don't shrink, and one can predict one's spending and consumption. For business, it means more predictability and possibility to reduce the rates further on. Mr. Wechselberg said that we are flawed in terms of loan origination and loan accessibility. Our policy is to raise the accessibility of credit and reduce the rates, but building upon the lowering inflation. We shouldn't just give out cheap money because the inflation will soar and the loan availability will not become better, which was proved by very many countries and ourselves. And for business, low inflation means a challenge because they should reduce the costs and enhance labor productivity. One cannot transfer the costs on the shoulders of the consumers in low inflation contexts. So you're quite correct. It is a structural factor, a long-term one, and motivating. The adjustment of economy to low inflation has been an occurrence, but this is a non-linear process, and management professionals say that there are several stages of how people get accustomed to change. First, they reject any goals and they laugh at that, say it's unattainable, it's not realistic. The second stage is that people doubt about the results because they have the figures at hand in front of themselves, the numbers, but they doubt that inside themselves. They don't have the confidence. And the third stage is when people perceive it as the new normal and they start using the fruit, ripening the fruit of the low inflation. We dream of that third stage, but so far we haven't achieved that. I hope in the near future we will shift to that, and in this case the low inflation would be perceived as a foundation for predictability and long-term planning.
Incidentally, about the interest rates, I'd like to join Maxim Oreshkin. The analysis reveals that long-term rates, especially for small and medium enterprises, have dropped to a historic low, and short-term interests are also decreasing at a faster rate than with regard to long-term loans. That means that people believe more in the predictability and sustainability of low inflation. So there are also problems with the lending and accessibility of loans. But I'd like to point out that banks have become more cautious about risks, as Viktor Felixovich has highlighted, and that is a good thing. That is one of the good factors. We saw some periods when lending increased, but IPO and investment did not increase at the same rate. Investors are very cautious about risks, but when banks are not cautious about risks, that is not a good thing. We have to think about investment projects based not just on borrowed money, but also based on attracting capital to these business projects. And it requires a whole nother level of transparency, corporate governance, as well as investors' confidence to the business circles to that. Loans are going to be more accessible, but you cannot only count on borrowed money. Loans should not grow faster than the GDP. There can be some short streaks when this happens, but we have to count upon attracting capital. This is an important element of an investment climate, and a very good investment climate is also dependent on low inflation. Thank you, Madam Nabiulian. And now a question about the budget. Last year, we talked a lot about the budget maneuver. We talked about the possibility of decreasing the non-productive expenditure of the budget, such as the defense and others, to concentrate on healthcare, education, and other productive sectors. That's the first thing. Secondly, how to fund that. And there were different proposals. First and foremost, the redistribution. There were proposals to increase the public debt, to use new instruments such as infrastructure, liabilities, and other instruments. Mr. Sulanov, what do you think about these issues? Issues? Well, these are not issues, not problems. These are proposals. As for the budget maneuver, we have already put that into place to a certain extent. Our defense expenditure has decreased if we count it as a share of our overall expenditure, whereas the share of our expenditure on healthcare and education, on human capital, has somewhat increased. When we discussed this budget maneuver a year ago, at stake was 2% of the GDP. There was talk about decreasing the defense and law enforcement expenditure. Certainly, these maneuvers take time. You cannot achieve that in a blink of an eye. But without investing into the infrastructure, we're not going to achieve growth rate. That is evident, and this is a challenge for the next political period. I'm talking about air transport, roads, especially in the eastern part of our country, in the Russian Far East. There are some issues you can only get from Khabarovsk to Vladivostok through Moscow, which is absolutely inadmissible. The issue of developing infrastructure is going to be paramount. It's going to be one of our priorities in our new budgets, in our new plans. And the same goes about investment into the human capital. Indeed, we must engage more citizens, especially vulnerable groups of the population, into production processes. Moreover, services of high quality have to be affordable, regardless of whether you're in Moscow or any other part of our country. And we see that there are some problems, some lagging behind. Kristalina mentioned that, and we have to improve that. What about the sources? Raising the public debt? Well, in that case, we'll have to revisit the budget rule. And this is what we mentioned in the first part of our session. That would mean undermining the stability foundation which, thank God, has been created. What can be the sources? First and foremost, taxes. We will achieve better administration. Last year, we managed to use this instrument to attract more revenue by 1 percentage point, which is almost 1 trillion rubles. And if we continue that, then this will allow us to get greater revenue. We will also shut down the shadow sector, and this is where we're going to get money to achieve our priority tasks. These are additional resources for the economy. We're also going to think about amendments to the taxation system, to reducing the taxes that are too burdensome for the business. This will open up new opportunities for the business development and for increasing the budget revenues. So, using the reforms of the taxation system through improving our administration and governance, we're going to find new sources of our revenue to achieve this budget maneuver. If you have a look at our GDP, more than 20% of our GDP is spent on the social component, which is the human capital. And depending on how efficient this expenditure is, we're going to get this result or that result. In this particular context, we're up against a huge task of raising the efficiency of our current expenditure. And this is the task both for the government as a whole and for the agencies and government bodies that are responsible for the policies in these spheres. So I do not think it is the right thing to raise the public debt because that would undermine the stability foundation. Right now, what we need to effect is structural changes. As for your proposals, such as the infrastructure mortgage or special tax preferences, such as the special contracts, some targeted measures to support investors. Well, at a previous panel today, we talked about that. Right now, the economy is in such a shape that we have to achieve more targeted responses, helping taxpayers, linking them with the administrators. We also have to support investors, but in a targeted manner. If we see investors willing to invest into our economy, we can provide some tax preferences to them, and we've got the necessary tools in place for that. I believe this is how we should support the growth which we saw start in late 2016 and which we saw in 2017. So using these instruments, using the tax maneuver, raising the efficiency of how we spend money, we are going to achieve good results. And also by supporting the investors who come up with proposals for development. This is what is going to drive growth and development next year. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Silvanov. And what do you think, Pavel Anatolyevich, about the role of the budget and the maneuver and the economic growth in the coming years? Yes, as far as the priorities are concerned, we have coinciding views. We think about the sources and the tasks at hand, but the rationale is as follows. By 2019-2020, the Russian economy can get at a growth rate of 3% or in 3.5% and even 4%. And if we look at the drivers of this future growth, given all the sources of investment, public investment, private investment, foreign direct investment, we'll get 2% of growth through investment zero or a little negative growth due to a drop in the labor, and 2% per percentage point as technological development. So that means that our priority has to be focused on labor productivity and on improving the human capital. And our priority is only real if it is reflected in the budget. If we have a look at the productive expenditure of all budgets, the funds, the regional budgets, the federal, then we'll see that these expenditures account for 11% of the GDP, whereas the leaders in technologies and human capital, they have 16 to 18% of the GDP. I refer to their expenditure on education, on healthcare. Education is easily calculated. The expenditure on education, you can calculate how successful children are. This provides companies with more opportunities to find highly qualified labor and also achieve training or retraining. And I think that step by step, in 6 years, we can get an increase of 4.5%. The same goes about healthcare. It helps to improve human capital through greater life expectancy, through lower morbidity and mortality rates. All these factors, all these indicators are easily calculated, and improving them will require greater budget expenditure. Right now is 3%, but we can raise it to 4% in 6 years. And as for the infrastructure, right now, agriculture and railroads account for 2.2%. We want it to be at 3%. Yes, we need railroads, infrastructural agglomerations, and new technologies, digital technologies that have to be implemented. And this requires concrete projects which will involve not just the budgeted investment, but also non-budget and extra budgetary investment. Some projects are underway at the Economic Development Ministry, but the federal roads have been improved and modernized, and the greatest regional roads are also going to have to be improved if we want to raise the mobility of our citizenry. Now, as for the last issue, under the current growth rate, when the growth is only making first steps, we do not think we have to change the taxation system. It would be better if the income tax and the VAT and other taxes remain at the same level. Well, we shouldn't touch them, so to speak, the most important taxes. Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask Victor to comment on the role taxation changes can have, what the business thinks has to be changed in taxation. Do there have to be any changes at all? The taxation system is a very important factor for stability and predictability in terms of doing business. There is no doubt that the taxation system is a very important, if not the definitive factor. Let me point out the problem that exists in this context today. The slogan of taxation system stability has become quite popular with the Russian government. And a stereotype can emerge that the real taxation system is not changing. And indeed, the main components of the taxation system, the profits tax, the individual income tax, the VAT, have remained the same for quite some time, and we have grounds to expect that these taxes are not going to change. But at the same time, the government is taking many measures that change the real burden for the business. I refer in particular the decisions on introducing or abolishing certain preferences, the decrees on tariffs, the measures the government undertakes with regard to some environmental regulations. And I'd like to highlight that if we take all these changes together, then we'll see that the real burden for the business is increasing, even though the major taxes remain unchanged. And I'd like to underline that the business is learning. The Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs has addressed the government and the president on multiple occasions, asking them to make this process of changes more transparent, more public, before this or that measure is made, proposed. They have to know what is going to happen or what might happen. I believe we've managed to foster a certain level of dialogue, but very often new mechanisms emerge and which do not have the same impact as the government might want them to have. Let me cite you one of the recent examples, which is related to measures on the investment tax deduction. This measure was adopted at the end of last year. That means that you can announce that you are going to invest in this or that facility, all the while committing yourself to operate this facility for a certain time period. Should you fail to perform the commitment you have assumed, you're going to be fined hugely, and it can bring to naught all the benefits that you might have got when you announced this measure and once you got the deduction. So the flexibility is gone, the predictability is gone, but still other things are improving, and it gives us a context to find new sources for investment. The tax preferences have been under discussion recently, and if we think it through carefully, then it might work. Another thing I'd like to point out is as follows. The federal decisions on preferences are further transferred to the regional level, and it is up to the regional authorities to make a decision on specific matters. We all understand full well that a lion's share of our regions need donations from the federal budget, and you cannot anticipate them to resort to these mechanisms, to preferences, for instance, on a huge scale. It is hardly possible. So a question arises, at which level preferences have to be introduced in terms of investment mechanisms? At the same time, I'd like to point out that there is a positive development. Honorable ministers have mentioned that. We have different forms and methods of supporting investment projects. Right now, there is a huge discussion going on about SPEAK's special investment contracts, which will grant some preferences and privileges. There are other measures to support import substitution. There are measures to support enterprises that export their products. There are special measures to support the Russian producers. And if we take all these measures together, we will be able to say that the government has managed to come up with a wonderful array of instruments, a good toolkit, which helps to stimulate and spur on investment stability. And I do hope that 2018, as well as subsequent years, will be the years when the business is going to resort actively to the methods and mechanisms proposed by the government. Thank you, Mr. Vekselberg. My last question of the second part of our discussion, I'd like to ask you, Ms. Georgieva, how do you think the world economy is going to develop in 2018? What are going to be the shifts in trade environment and trade conditions for Russia? What is going to be the direction of capital flows? Well, the forecasts for next year are quite positive. We believe that the recovery that started in 2017 is going to continue. Certainly, as always, there are concerns. We are concerned that there might be some risks along the road of success. Some of the risks have already been mentioned by Elvira. Namely, after many years of low interest rates, there is a huge indebtedness accumulated. And I refer to the indebtedness of both budgets and companies. It is not an issue for Russia, but in other places and the world, elsewhere, it is a problem. And if interest rates are changed more aggressively, more drastically, then for some countries, this is going to be a huge issue, and there is a risk that there's a risk of spillover for other countries. Elvira said that already, but I'm hopeful that we're going to be cautious and prudent, and there's going to be no drastic change, that the change is going to be smooth. But I like to say that some of the developing countries are already seeing some problems. More risky markets are more attractive when there is an excess of liquidity and when you cannot get the same yields in developed countries. As a result, investors and companies say, just take that money, it is a very good juncture, it's all very cheap. But when you take too much, then you can service, even when the interest rates are low, then it is a risk not just for you, but also for the world economy. Secondly, the second problem, which unfortunately Russia faces as well, is the low growth rate of labor productivity. We used to see this problem primarily in the developed countries, the total factor productivity. This total factor productivity is not increasing, it is low. It is an issue already in the developed countries and also in the emerging markets, and Russia is facing it as well. And we have to be frank and open about it. Without raising labor productivity, it is going to be hugely difficult to achieve high performance. And thirdly, there are some things that we know nothing of yet, but something that is going to happen. The world is not as it used to be when we were born, when crises used to be very serious, but sort of courteous. A crisis comes, we fight it, it departs, and another one arrives. But this is no longer the case. We have to be flexible. We have to be ready. We have to be ready for the unexpected. So the flexibility of regulation, of administration, of governance, this is what we have to embrace. It is difficult, but we have to do it. Thank you very much. Before I ask the next question, I'd like to ask the audience. And the question is as follows. What is going to be the balance of opportunities and risks in 2018 for the Russian economy and for the world economy? The first answer, positive both for Russia and for the rest of the world. Second, positive for the rest of the world, negative for Russia. Negative for the rest of the world, positive for Russia. That is number 3. And number 4, negative both for Russia and for the rest of the world. Now, please proceed to vote. I think we can get down to the last round of questions. And let me begin with Mr. Siliwanov because he asked me to let him go in 5 minutes. And my question is as follows. At the end of your previous remarks, you said that one of the sources for financing the budget maneuver is going to be tax administration. I agree with you entirely. And for me, in particular, there are 2 important blocks that I'd like to ask you to comment on. First, building a unified mechanism for customs and tax administration, because these 2 types of fees, the customs and taxes, are charged separately. And I believe that it can only be changed if imports is seen not just as something imported, but also in terms of what the tax service is viewing. Moreover, the risks have to be also calculated in a different manner. The solvency of importers has to be taken into account if we can track all of this. In other words, what we need is a unified mechanism for the Federal Tax Service and for the Federal Customs Service, and secondly, the currency control. The tax that exists certainly is obsolete, but it has to be substituted with something else, with, for instance, fighting the AML, NFT, and also tax control. I think this can make a contribution to tax administration. What do you think about that? Indeed. And sanctions have also been mentioned, I believe, especially amid sanctions and restrictions. We have to create such a climate that is going to be more liberal, more attractive, so as to minimize the influence of restrictions introduced against Russia. I refer in particular to taxes, to the currency liberalization, to raising competitiveness, decreasing the share of the public sector, and also improving the situation of non-government-run companies, which are still dominant. Currency control and forex regulation are important issues on the agenda. We have already, in part, liberalized some requirements with regard to individuals, to physical persons. As far as their foreign accounts are concerned, they do not necessarily have to get back the money. We believe that the issue of repatriating the currency profits, which is still in our legislation for legal entities is something from the Soviet past, a mechanism which we will have to revisit. Simplifying forex transactions, as well as the current forex regulation, is high on our agenda this year. In terms of changing the legislation, certainly we're going to work together with the central bank, but let me reiterate that in this particular context, we have to break down the old principles that were laid down when the old system was in place decades ago, because right now it is obsolete.
With respect to administration, the customs and tax services began to administer taxes jointly, and they exchange information and databases, and the customs value at border directly goes to the taxation database, and the goods are traced from the point of entry to the retail sales with the help of cashier equipment. Now the risk management systems between these two agencies are shared, and they have exchanges. Those companies in the green zones enjoy preferential regimes with respect to the VAT refund and customs procedures. If we see that these are clean companies working officially to the rule and without no rebukes, they see more preferential regimes while dealing with these administrations. Like by 2020, we'll have several e-declaration centers that will allow us, without getting in touch with customs officials and officers, to clear cargoes and batches, both imported and exported for the economic actors. So the remote interaction with the customs will reduce administrative costs and any risks, eliminate risks, and that will entail great administration, so that, like normal law-abiding companies, should enjoy lesser costs and have better and higher profits and give more revenue to the state coffers. Thank you very much for participating. Yeah, I've got asked to be excused. I've got to go. The next question is to Mr. Oreshkin. Last year, we discussed the need for our economy to switch to a new model, a growth model that would not depend and rely heavily on our international partners. Everybody is in agreement, but what is to be done, and what is to be done to reduce the over-reliance? I will reiterate what I and Madam Nabiulina said. The oil revenues account still for a big share of the budget, and we're one of the leading global producers. But what we've been able to do in the macroeconomic policy, they have been able to mitigate the volatility of the commodity markets and its impact on the economy. So we have already switched to this new model. Our growth is not over-reliant on the oil price. In 2017, only 3% was the contribution of the oil price, much lower rate than we could have had otherwise. The long-term stability is now at a qualitatively different, better level. To mention the main objectives. I will not brief on them in detail, but I will stop at one thing. In the morning we had a digital economy session, and at the end of it, when we spoke about the hurdles to an active growth, we spoke about the living standards as a key pillar, as any new spiral of a global economic development would see the individual's role increased. So better living standards and life quality would be a key prerequisite for maintaining and holding talents and stopping their outflow. From the public administration perspective, it is important to shift from sectoral approach to people-oriented one. We've been saying on many occasions today we should raise the expenditure on healthcare, which is not sufficient. We should increase the quality of healthcare, not spend much money. Just like we needn't hear reports from officials that they have increased spending by 1 or 2 trillion. No, we should have a step change, qualitative change for the better to enhance the living standards and life quality. In this case, our economy will become competitive, enjoying sustainable growth, heading for future, not the past. Thank you. And I ask you, Madam Bulna, a similar question. You cited some of the impressive figures, like 50% of budget revenues was the share of oil and gas in the golden era. Now it's down to 40, which is still a lot. Well, we discussed unpegging, and how could the central bank contribute apart from the floating rate? Well, the floating rate provides a mitigation and certain unpegging. If you look at the elasticity of our exchange rate, it used to be 0.95, which was very high elasticity, and the ruble rate followed the oil price closely in early 2015, just right after we had shifted to the floating exchange rate. And a floating exchange rate, as well as low inflation, is an institution. I think it is so. In 2016, the elasticity went down to 0.4, and this in 2017 it was 0.13 only, 1.3. And the fact that the economic actors got used to the floating exchange rate is proven by the fact that the tax payout periods are no more acute for the exchange rate. And the fiscal rule also contributed to the unpegging, but the lower reliance that we have currently is insufficient for our economy to diversify. And the key challenge, I reiterate, well, probably there should be several pillars of this policy to help our economy diversify and bolster that, make it less exposed to external factors. These would include predictability, taxation regime that would be predictable, the interest rate regime that would be predictable with low inflation at the foundation, at core. Long-term finance, which is not yet present. What we need is a long-term funding institution which requires a long track record of low inflation to have the confidence and the savings institutions in place. So far, the funded component of the pension fund is something that concerns us. The savings of the pension fund is something that concerns us. And competition is what we need. Why do we need innovation if I am a monopolist? No, neither labor productivity nor other things would be necessary. So competition is a key medium, and the finance sector competition is our priority. Well, we hear voices that we reduce the number of banks, insurance companies and pension funds, and thus you reduce competition. Definitely, if we have one or two or three banks, that will be a monopoly or oligopoly, but still we believe we have the sufficient number of stakeholders. The level playing field is what we call competition. And we don't think that competition in the finance sector runs counter to a temporary increase in the role of government in some of the financial institutions for the sake of their sanation and resolution, which has been happening over the past recent months. Like in Scandinavia in the early 1990s, they made their financial system more sound. The government owned those institutions for a while, and the crisis of 2009 and the downturn of 2009 was passed smoother by the Scandinavians because they had eliminated some of the problems in 1990s. The US saw the governmental participation in almost each of the major banks in the downturn times. The question is whether we'll be able to privatize them swiftly and bring them to the market, and we are set in doing so. We understand that the investments in the financial sector would be quite beneficial, but still we will be consistent, although there is lack of confidence in us. But in the central bank, we are committed to that. The unfair competition, the unfair conditions, unequal playing field is the main obstacle. Or like if we lend a helping hand to someone and don't do that to some other people, that will be an obstacle, a hurdle. In early 2000s, the main concerns from the business community was that there are some actors that don't pay all the taxes and the customs levies. Same refers to the financial sphere. If, like, the proprietors bail in, this is one thing, and some other bank may have fictitious balance sheets, and which is bad, and we shouldn't let them stay at the market. We should uphold the private property right, but we shouldn't be overindulgent, and we have to resort to a short and temporary increase in the role of government in the banking sector, but we are committed to privatize that shortly. And thanks to the government, it provided funding now and back in 2008 and 2009 to both governmental and private banks without any bias. The only issue is still pending is that the private banks don't have a proper access to the funds from the government and governmental companies. We will rely on rating agencies better, and our rating agency industry is progressing, and we believe that it's another factor of the unfair competition to be eliminated. So I think that the investment climate development has all these elements at core, and the central bank could contribute to the financial sector, long-term funding and fair competition. These are the pillars, the key pillars. Thank you, Madam Nabiulina. You didn't offend anyone. The central bank indeed closes badly governed banks, not state-run or private ones. And I told you that only a dozen of non-governmental, non-publicly owned high schools merit attention. And I wanted to respond to the currency control. The finance minister left us, unfortunately, but still, sometimes the central bank is seen to be as an opponent of liberalizing currency controls and limitations, restrictions. We always were consistent that it should not be imposed and enacted. I mean the restrictions, but full liberalization would be a very simple solution, but we have some dubious operations control system relying on the obsolete previously existing system, and we should borrow the international best practices with mechanisms and frameworks to control money laundering and other black or gray operations without obligations to repatriate the forex revenue. We should see what we can borrow, and in this case we can adapt it. We will spill the baby together with the bathtub water. We don't need that. And I think that it's going to be joint work by government and central bank. The currency control is the responsibility of both the government and the central bank, so we together in concert should work on the new formulae that will help us control money laundering and preclude that. Definitely we have some achievements in this domain, and we should not backslide on that, but still let's not dismantle it altogether. We are in favor. The Strategic Solutions Center, like in a month's time, will come up with a preliminary report on that. And a question to Pavel, as a follow-up on what Madam Nabulina said on governmental and private institutions. Well, roughly speaking, isn't that a state-run capitalism model that we're heading towards? Thank you. We've seen lots of speculations on that, and there are different assessments as per the stake of government in our economy. Some say it's 70%, but we believe it's an overstatement. In 2017, together with the RENIPA Academy, we had a study looking into all the sectors and separate corporates to calculate and reckon what is the share of the public sector. We found out, we used several methodologies, the OECD and IMF methodology and the Russian balance sheet. We found out that it's not like 70%. No, our figure is 46%. 20-something out of that is the government-owned, and around 25% is the added value, like the salaries and others. So 46% is the overall stake of the public sector in the Russian economy. We will come out with this study, I hope. What are the lessons? For example, first of all, we should raise the labor productivity in the public sector, which the public administration system should be more efficient, and the state-run companies as well. We have open access data on some sectors, the oil and gas and telecom and processing sectors, and we can see that the revenue per one employee in Russian state-run companies is 4 to 5 times lower than if we compare them with private ones. If we compare Russian state-run companies with global leaders, the difference is from 5 to 10 times. I mean, the labor productivity gap is 5 to 10 times, and we are to narrow this gap, to bridge that. And let's take oil companies. Who of them have digital model of developing like a digital platform to develop deposits and oil fields? In the public sector, oil companies, it's inexistent, while in private oil and gas majors, we have these platforms. 46%, is it a lot or not? Definitely we should reduce that, because if we look at some other international countries that use the state-run capitalism, our share is 5 to 10% higher than that of those. It's higher than in emerging economies, and even higher than in developed, industrialized countries. So the room for competition and private enterprise in this country is smaller and narrower than in other countries, which impacts negatively the growth rates. It's on the downside, and some say that we have owned some of the assets on purpose because of strategic interest. But we are aware that there is a huge gap between the strategic interests and or some expediency or an asset that is a far cry from being privatized and sold at the market. If we increase the labor productivity and corporate governance in those companies, and if we are on par with the private peers, that will be definitely a huge step forward, and the stake of government is high indeed. Thank you. 2 short questions, and then we take stock of the voting outcomes. Mr. Vekselberg, doing business, this rating was mentioned on many occasions. Over the 5 years, we rose from position 120 to the 35th position. Is it a huge leap forward, or is it just merely idle figures and numbers? Well, we just learned how to calculate properly. Well, you are frank, you are quite sincere. Well, in earnest, I must say that today, conjuring these indicators against the backdrop of firming sanctions against us and protectionism, that would be very relative, you know. For our business community, the developments, domestic developments inside the country matter much more. And I think that these should be the perception we are to be guided by, not the ranking in that classification. We have to work hard, and there is room for advancement in terms of a convenient environment for our entrepreneurs. I will not cite all the pillars of that, but eventually it is to boil down to enabling Russian citizens with some capabilities and expertise and potential not to be afraid of doing business and risk-taking, and losing something in a bankruptcy should not be a failure, a complete disaster, no. And the word and the term entrepreneur in this country should not be a curse word. I would want to hope that the GDP we swear by is created by entrepreneurs in the public sector. So anyway, it's us who create the GDP. Thank you. The last question for Madam Georgieva. You and Madam Nabiulina touched upon the financial sector and its development. The profoundness of the financial sector would guarantee the economic development, and the after effects are interconnected. Over the past years, a lot changed. The financial sanctions have been imposed from the outside. The national payment system and banking systems in the nation have been in place. How do you think, to what extent the growth in Russia is linked to the financial sector development? And is there a proper toolkit for the financial services? Definitely the state of the financial sector matters a lot. If you look at the growth factors like human capital, manpower, and labor productivity, to have these things working properly, we need affordable accessible and long-term financing. If we look back at what has been done, there have been many achievements in making the banking system more sound, but there is a lot of room for advancement there. But it's also important to develop other financial tools. The capital markets, pension funds, insurance, underwriting and long-term money will rely on that, and the use of new technology will help. We should promote outsourcing. In Russia, it's quite popular. One should look at the near future prospects at first, like 100 million, maybe 10%. There is a share of pyramids there, or shell companies. But greater flexibility of the financial system matters a lot. In closing, I'll say that what I believe is the main thing is access to finance for small companies. And one should work hard and do its best in this domain. Many of these small and medium enterprises are faced with the following question: to be hanged or to be executed? So the choice is like this for them. So they don't have any viable options. And unless we get to grips with that, there will be no solution. And small companies are much more flexible. Only 10% of Russian companies believe they have innovation. OECD average is 30 to 40%. We should be aware of the risks of small and big, by the by, businesses to provide proper growth in this country. And as it is the last round for today's panel, I want to thank all the audience, all the public, for being so patient to listening to my poor Russian. Thank you. The Russian language of yours is wonderful, is fluent. Thank you. And my last point, the socio and voting survey data I have at hand is quite unexpected, surprising, and probably we could make some comments or wishes. So the first question, whether you believe that the global economy is out of the downturn of 2008 and the Russian is outside of the 2015 to 16. Both yes, 13%. World yes, Russia no, 50% and something. World no, Russia yes, 7%. Both no, 29 almost %. So 60% believe that the world is out of the woods, and 21 respondents believe that Russia has overcome the crisis results. I thought it would be more upbeat. We keep inflating our problems and diminishing the problems of others. So I believe this is quite natural, a picture. I believe Kristalina is right. And no one knows what is a crisis and when it comes to an end, like we used to have cycles and woman bus cycles, and now black swans are everywhere. They fly all over the space. And we should be ready for more uncertainty. So outside everybody is out of the crisis or no, we're somewhere in between. I believe that the audience is ready for the worst case scenario. They probably bought some tinned meat and And the world also, people believe that 40% of respondents believe that the world is not out of the crisis yet, so it's going to be Armageddon. Christina.
This is very curious, but for a person who used to live in Russia, it is not as strange as that. Because we in Russia, there is this pessimistic worldview which is getting worse in winter. Maybe if we were to hold this poll in summer, well, we have to reschedule the Gaidar Forum to hold it in spring. Well, I think it's the specifics of the audience. In another audience, the result would have been different. Too well informed, yes. The sampling is not representative. It testifies to the fact that even if the economy has recovered, people have not yet done so. That is what we can see on the slide. But as for the growth rate, we believe that the growth rate is only if it is 67%, which we used to have in the naughty years. Right now, the growth rate is 1.5, 2%, and people do not appreciate that. Secondly, what was the main growth factor for the Russian economy 2018? Recovery growth after GDP reduction in 2015, 2016, 23%, improvement of external environment, almost 16%, reduction of macroeconomic risk, low inflation, low budget deficit, predictable economic policy, rising optimism of economic agents, 27.5%, and just a concatenation of different one-time factors, 34%. So most people believe in coincidences, and yet some efforts of the government and of the central bank have been appreciated, given a very high assessment by a third who are here. Yes, well, it is a little bit disconcerting that we're not at the first place. Just, I'd like to say that this coincidence of different factors, if the audience thinks that, and I do not think, maybe the population think that we've been lucky. When it's bad, we've been not lucky. When it's good, then we believe we're lucky. I don't know what to do about it. We just have to accept it as a given. But what's heartening is that most believe that the external environment has helped, even though the oil prices increased. So it shows us mentally that we unpeg our expectations from the oil prices. If it is a success, I believe this is the positive side of the moment, that people do not link the economic performance with the oil prices. Most people know that there are some internal factors everyone is keeping silent about. Well, as people say, I hope we'll be lucky next year. This is what the next question is going to reveal to us. But on a more serious note, following the rationality of the previous answer, it is only logical, it is only natural. Mr. Vexelberg, I'm prone to agree. It is not unexpected that the answer is just like that. It corresponds to the previous pessimism as prevailing in this audience. Curiously, when I read the fourth question, I was asking myself, what are these favorable factors? How are we to find them in 2017? Given answer 3, what are these favorable things we saw apart from the oil? That's not the oil. Well, in sociology, when we get this split, it means either we don't know or we just don't care. Maybe this is the scenario exactly. The third question, what is going to be the balance of opportunities and risks in 2018 for Russia and for the world economy? Despite the previous answers, positive both for Russia and the world, 50% positive for the world, negative for Russia, 24%, a fourth negative for the world, positive for Russia, another 10% negative both for Russia and the world, 16%. So 75% are positive about the world, but 60% are positive about Russia. It contradicts to the previous answers. Well, what helps us put up with that? Well, maybe we'll be lucky, as Kristalina has said. Commenting on the third question, I'd like to get back to question number 2. Certainly, when we account for the successes by one-time factors, it is also some sort of a diagnosis. It means that we are not completely confident of our own capabilities. But the first answer, maybe people are still dependent on external factors, the oil prices, which is right now very high, and it maybe fuels the optimism. That's my comment. I have to agree. The optimism that we see corresponds to the real situation in our economy. I do hope that when we gather next year, we will hold this poll once again. Now, the optimism that we see right now with regard to question 3 is also going to spill over to other questions. I'll keep these data. The answer to the first question is contradicting, or rather, going long. Now, number 3, maybe we'll be lucky, maybe we won't. And I love all of you, and I'd like to wish you all the best. Mr. Vekselberg, I think it's only logical. All of us love to blame the past, but still we wait for something better. And this is what this graph shows us. I agree, this is optimism. Colleagues, now we have to close our session. I'd like to thank everyone, the panelists and the audience. Thank you very much.